If your YouTube algorithm is anything like mine, right now you'd be getting suggested video after suggested video about Vladimir Putin. And usually he's referred to as a dictator, and people say stuff like this.
I think at some point, a dictator who is in such a position for such a long time really starts to lose a sense of reality.
Now, I'm not at all going to dispute that in this video, but instead, by the end of it, you'll know exactly why Putin is referred to as a dictator. If you're going to talk about Putin and Russia-Ukraine with any sort of authority, you really have to know how he consolidated power. Now, this isn't our first Russia video of the series. About a month ago, we covered the rise and fall of Boris Yeltsin's regime, and we left with him resigning and somewhat admitting to being a failure. In his way, Putin ran for president and formed a unity party, basically a coalition of non-communist groups. In the 2000 presidential elections, he smashed the Communist Party's candidate, Gennady Zyuganov, 53.3% to 29.5%. Now, in that Yeltsin video, which I would recommend watching, we saw that during the 1990s, Yeltsin allowed plant owners to buy the formerly state-owned companies at below market value. This extremely wealthy group became known as the Russian oligarchs, and Putin vowed to stamp out corruption, to destroy the oligarchs, to restore law and order, and to enforce a strictly controlled market economy. And so immediately, two of the oligarchs entered Putin's hit list. The first was a guy called Vladimir Gusinsky. Essentially, throughout the 1990s, he acquired both media companies and 30% of a huge natural gas company called Gazprom. FIFA players would recognize it as Zenit St. Petersburg's sponsor. Now, it was common practice for the oligarchs to bribe auctioneers who were auctioning companies formerly run by the Soviet government. Putin accused Gusinsky of participating in this corruption, and with the government being the majority shareholder in Gazprom, they ousted its owners and then, using Gazprom, forcibly bought the ownership of Gusinsky's main media company, Media Most. Media Most owned the mainstream news network called NTV, and NTV was a popular network that had been critical of the government in the 1990s. So if you follow the plot here, Putin arrested Gusinsky on charges of corruption and through Gazprom bought out Gusinsky's news network. The message that this sent to the Western world was that this was a crackdown on government criticism, and in response to the arrest, US President Bill Clinton said that he did not think that people should be arrested for criticism of the Kremlin. Gusinsky later fled to Spain. The second oligarch that came into Putin's crosshairs was Boris Berezovsky, who importantly owned Channel One and almost certainly acquired his $3 billion net worth through some form of corruption. Berezovsky had initially supported Putin and helped form the Unity Bloc, but later he'd go into opposition and was critical of Putin in the build-up to the 2000 election. In late 2000, Russia demanded that he appear for questioning, but by that point he was in the UK where he'd remain until his death in 2013. Effectively, Putin's targeting of these two oligarchs secured Russian control over two of the biggest mainstream networks. In October of 2001, Putin made another successful move to further consolidate his power. Like I said before, he was part of the Unity Bloc, which was already a coalition in itself. Putin formed another coalition with one of its rivals, the Fatherland Russia movement, to become the United Russia Party. This gave them overwhelming numbers in the Duma, which was Russia's parliament. Not only that, but Putin established a rule that parties with fewer than 10,000 members could not take part in national elections. This was really important because there were a lot of parties in the Duma, and so it actually reduced the number of parties competing in elections from 180 to 100. Now, 100's still obviously a lot, but this stopped oligarchs from funding their own groups to immediately contest in the elections because they had to do the groundwork of recruiting 10,000 members. Speaking of, I'm doing the groundwork of recruiting 10,000 subscribers, so if you like what you're seeing, hit that subscribe button and also like the video. It really helps the video get out to people, and to be honest, someone's got to stop someone like Seth Meyers from showing up when people search up Putin. But Putin knew that picking a fight with every single oligarch would see him toppled very quickly. They had simply accumulated too much power during the Yeltsin regime. So Putin made a bargain with the oligarchs. He'd already made an example out of Gusinsky and Berezovsky, not to mention Russia's wealthiest oligarch, Mikhail Khodorkovsky. And so with this leverage, Putin made a grand bargain with the oligarchs to let them retain the rest of their powers in exchange for explicit support of his regime. Take the oligarch Roman Abramovich, for example, former owner of Chelsea Football Club, and in reality the one who funded them to success. By the way, love reacts for anyone who can guess my Premier League team. But when Russia invaded Ukraine earlier this year, Abramovich was personally sanctioned by the British government and he stepped down immediately. The media mistakenly made it out to be that the controversy was around him being mates with Putin, but that wasn't it at all. It was actually because he was indebted to Putin and in something of a domestic non-aggression pact with him. Putin also greatly benefited from the commodities boom of the early 2000s. The Russian economy had gone backwards under Yeltsin due to the failure of shock therapy and the oligarchs concentrating much wealth into so few hands. However, there was a huge minerals and oil boom right as Putin was coming into power, of which Russia was well resourced, and just have a look at the explosion in Russia's GDP per capita. Finally, Putin consolidated power by trebling the budget of the secret police. The FSB replaced the Soviet KGB, and an increasing number of important government positions were filled by people with a security background. It is, however, worth noting that it wasn't all positive for Putin in his first term. In 2000, the nuclear submarine Kursk mysteriously sunk with all 118 crew members vanishing. It took Putin several days to return from vacation. In 2002, a group of 40 to 50 armed Chechens held 850 Russians hostage in a Moscow theatre. For context on who the Chechens are, watch the Yeltsin video here. Putin refused to accede to any of their demands, and though 39 terrorists were killed, it didn't come until after 129 hostages were killed. Putin was heavily criticised for his handling of it all. But Russia was rich, and so Russia was happy. And Putin's image could not have been more different to Yeltsin's. With Yeltsin, everyone saw a soft leader who was ruled by the oligarchs at the expense of ordinary Russians. With Putin, it was a strong leader who stood up to the oligarchs and brought back Russian wealth. Putin smashed it at the 2004 election. The Communist Party's Nikolai Kharitonov was the nearest contender with 13.7% of the vote, but Putin picked up 71% of the vote. I'm going to try and keep the second term pretty short, but it is really important, and I'd love to do a podcast length episode on it one day. To help us get to that podcast, consider supporting us on Patreon for just $1.50 a month. If just 4 people sign up after each video, we can get there by the end of the year. Also, my subscriber question for today is this: where would Russia be today if, like Yeltsin, Putin retired after his second term? So it's in his second term that Putin really starts to make some moves. Now, importantly, in a 2005 Kremlin speech, Putin called the collapse of the Soviet Union the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. It's for this reason that people argue that the invasion of Ukraine is an attempt to rebuild a communist USSR. However, I think that's a pretty lazy argument. Remember, Putin's in the United Russia Party, and his direct opponents are the Communist Party. But just after his election in September of 2004, Chechen terrorists took over a school in Beslan, taking 1,100 students and adults hostage. After 3 days, Russian security forces stormed the school, but this saw 300 killed, including 186 children. So in June of 2006, the Duma gave additional powers to the FSB to send commandos to assassinate terrorist groups, and this was at the power of President Putin. But very interestingly, a former FSB member, Alexander Litvinenko, claimed that the Beslan hostage crisis was an inside job designed to increase Putin's powers. Now, there'll be a number of inside job theories about to be put forward, but I'm not personally weighing in on any of them. I'm just explaining the nature of the accusation to explain how Putin further increased his powers. So, Litvinenko had taken refuge in the UK since 2000, where he worked as a journalist and consultant with British intelligence. However, in November of 2006, Litvinenko was killed in London by a rare radioactive poison, polonium-210. The British believed that Russian security agent Andrei Lugovoy was behind the poisoning and demanded that he be extradited from Russia, but Russia refused. Britain never publicly blamed Putin, but there was a clear inference that the Russian state was behind it. Add this to the murder of Putin critic Anna Politkovskaya in October of 2006, and rightly or wrongly, Putin was developing a reputation as a leader who would silence dissent at all costs. During this time, Putin also started to voice his concerns about NATO. In February of 2007 at the Munich Security Conference, Putin complained about the dominance of America and reiterated the verbal promises made to Russia during the fall of the Soviet Union that NATO would not move any further east. America had been supportive of Yeltsin because he stood against the Communist Party, but now even with Putin standing against the same party, his rhetoric around Eastern Europe was starting to put them offside. Now, in Putin's second term, Russia really started to recover from its awful economic position of the 90s. Russia was the largest exporter of gas and second exporter of oil behind Saudi Arabia. They also heavily invested in the tech revolution. For example, software exports were only worth $184 million in 2001, but in 2006 was worth $1.5 billion. Worried that the oil prices would fall, Putin kept a large amount of cash in reserve. Although this resulted in stagflation in 2008, the reserve became extremely useful during the GFC, and the economy was growing again in 2009. Given how much better the economy was under Putin than under Yeltsin, Putin retained his high popularity within Russia. However, the constitution prohibited Putin from standing for a third consecutive term as president, and so in 2008, Putin nominated his ally Dmitry Medvedev to be the United Russia's presidential candidate in the 2008 election. Medvedev announced that if he won, he'd nominate Putin to be his prime minister, and campaigned on the slogan, "Together we win." He ended up smashing the Communist Party's Gennady Zyuganov 70% to 18%. The Duma also ended up supporting the appointment of Putin as its leader, 392 votes to 56. It was only the communists who opposed Putin's nomination as prime minister. In September of 2011, Medvedev announced that he would not stand for president again, and officially nominated Putin to once again be the candidate for the United Russia Party. In 2012, Putin won convincingly with 63% of the vote, and this time, presidential terms were extended to 6 years, meaning constitutionally he could stay in until 2024. Not much would happen in between, right? Don't click off just yet. This series is designed to have you ready for a potential Third World War and to know the exact factors behind it. If you want to keep watching Russia, definitely check out the video on Yeltsin's regime in the 1990s. If you want to branch out to somewhere else in the globe, check out the video we made on what happened to Iraq after Saddam was deposed. Don't forget to let us know where Russia would be if Putin retired in 2008, and consider supporting us on Patreon for just the price of one of these rulers. We can't wait to see you next time for our next venture into a fascinating part of history.